Welcome back to Layer Academy. This is Mickey, and let's continue our URL shortener. In the previous video, we got our database set up and running, so that means that we can use a command such as php artisan tinker, and we can just pull in some information from our database to make sure that it is working correctly. In this video, we're going to be handling the front end here, or I should say the backend administration, as well as authentication for signing in and signing out. We still have our default Laravel application, and the first thing we're going to tackle is the routes to handle our authentication. So instead of storing them in the routes.php, I'm going to create a new folder called routes, just underneath HTTP. And then within that folder, I'm going to create a new file, and let's just call this administration routes.php. Now that we have this new file, let's head back over to our routes.php and let's include this file. So we'll say include routes and then administration routes.php. Let's save this and switch back to administration routes, and let's start adding in our routes here. So let's actually group this together. So we'll say route group. Let's give it a prefix, and that prefix will be administration. We'll make sure that's a lowercase a. Let's also tack on a namespace here. So we'll say namespace. Let's also keep this as administration. And let's have our function here. So what this will be is it will be, example.com/administration/whatever. Now if we head on into our group, let's create a new group for our authentication. So we'll have a route group, and let's prefix it with authentication. And within this group, let's add our first route here. So we'll say route get, and let's just get the default route that we're going to have here, and we will pass it into our auth controller, and we'll say index, and finally let's give it a name of administration.authentication. Now with this route created, we're going to have to create this auth controller here. So let's switch to our console, and we will use php artisan make controller, and we'll say auth controller. Now that Laravel has generated that controller for us, we can find it in controllers and authcontroller.php. However, we namespace this route here to administration. So that means that we're going to have to create a new folder underneath controllers called administration, and now we have to move our auth controller into that folder. So in Windows, I'll just simply cut, and I'll go into administration and paste it in. And now that we're working with the correct auth controller, let's add a public function for our constructor, and let's also add one for our index here. So we'll make another method, and we'll call it index. Our index function is very simple. Let's just have it return a view. So we'll say return view administration authentication, and then we'll just say index. And now we're going to have to create the folder structure. So in resources views, we'll make a new folder for administration, and then with that folder, let's make another one called authentication, and finally let's create a new file underneath there, and we will call it index.blade.php. Now before we start writing our index page, let's think about this. I don't want to reuse code over and over again, so let's go ahead and create a new folder underneath views, and we will call this layout, and this is just going to hold our master template. So we'll make a file here called master.blade.php, and let's add in some regular HTML code here. Now with our regular HTML, let's go ahead to the top and let's add in 2 bootstrap links. And the last link that we're going to add in here will be our font awesome. So we'll just copy this in. And let's finish our head tag up here, and for now let's just add a style tag. We'll come back and clean this up. Now let's skip down inside our body, and we'll add a script for jQuery itself, and the second script we're going to add is for Bootstrap. Now with that done, we need some way to yield out some content. So let's add a yield tag in here. And finally, in case we have any scripts, let's add a stack, and let's just call it script. Now this looks pretty good. The only thing that we're going to add to the top is let's include a blade file. So we'll say include, let's go to layout.partials.navigation. Now let's create that directory structure. So in layout, we need to go to a new folder called partials. And then within that folder, let's make a blade file called navigation.blade.php. And I'm just going to paste in the default navigation that comes with Bootstrap. And let's just take some time and clean this up because we don't need all these different links and stuff in here. So I'll just change the app name here, and let's get rid of some of these links such as the drop down. We'll take off the active class. And let's also remove the form element here. And that looks pretty good for now. We'll come back to the bottom part. But what we want is in here, let's have a paragraph, and we'll assign it navbar text. And let's say welcome back, and let's grab the current logged in user and pass the email in there. So with that information saved, let's head back over to index.blade.php, and let's extend layout.master. And we're just doing this now so we don't forget. And let's switch back over to our master file, our navigation. And we need to add in a check to make sure that the user is actually logged in. So let's say if auth check, and only if we are logged in, let's show this right hand navigation. So let's try this out in Chrome, and you can see we have our first error here. So our controller doesn't exist, and if sure enough we didn't update our namespace, so let's update our namespace now. And because we're no longer in the same namespace, let's add the controller. So we'll say use app http controllers controller. So when we extend our controller, it can find the base controller. Let's give this a refresh, and there we have it, a basic navigation. So we know that everything's working. So how do we log in? Well, let's work on that. Let's switch back to Sublime and load up our index, and we'll make our section for content. Make sure we end the section as well. And let's start adding some pretty basic HTML code here. We'll start off with a form. Let's leave it blank. We'll include our CSRF token, and let's use a Bootstrap panel for now. So we'll have a heading, and let's just say it's login, and let's just have a body, an empty body for now, and we'll include a footer, and inside this footer let's have a button that can log us in. So let's make it 8 wide and offset by 2, and we'll just have a submit button with success. Alright, let's try this out. And it looks pretty ugly, and I've missed a few things here. So let's change CSRF token to CSRF field. So we want the field input and not the token. And the other thing we need to do is head on over to our master and make sure that we wrap our content in a container. Alright, let's refresh, and my header isn't working. So let's switch back to our index file, and I've misspelled the panel heading. So save it, refresh, and everything works. So let's get working on the panel body itself. So we're already in the form, so let's add some form groups. We will have one for the email address and another one for the password. Now the final thing we have to do is in our form field itself, let's make the method post, and let's create the action. So we're going to go to our route administration.authentication.login. And this is a new route, so let's go ahead and add it to our administration routes. So we'll duplicate this line and let's just paste our name in, and let's make sure instead of index we're using login. And we're also posting, so let's go to our auth controller and create this function for login. And let's use the request variable, and for now let's just do a die and dump of our current input that we're going to pass through. Let's provide our form with an email and a password and then click login. You can see we're just dying and dumping a request here, and let's add some validation here. We will just be using the controller validate function. So to do this, let's have some rules set up, and our rules will be very simple. We will just have an email that is required as well as the password that is required. So nothing too fancy here. And underneath our rules, let's say this validates, this validate, and pass in our request as well as the rules. So if for some reason validation fails, this function is already going to return a redirect for us, and that redirect is going to have input as well as the errors from the message bag. So to show this working, if we just supply an email address and we click on login, the page is going to refresh here, but we're not getting any errors on the actual page. And that's because we're not spitting them out or displaying them. Let's switch back to Sublime, and in Views, Layout, Partials, let's create a new file, and let's just call this messages.blade.php. If we go over the code that I just pasted in, we make sure that our errors have more than 0 in it, and within our error bag we just get all the errors and retrieve them as a message. And let's do this for success as well, except we'll use the session. So with that in there, now we have to include our messages blade file. Well, you can include it anywhere you want. You could even have it on the master layout. But for this example, I'm just going to go to my index, and let's include it in the panel body. So we'll say include layout, partials, and messages. If we save this, switch back to Chrome, we try and log in, we can see we get our errors here. So the email and password field is required, or the email field is required. Now the only thing to do is, what happens if the user tries to log in and both the email and password is not right? Well, let's take a look at how we can do that. Switching back over to Sublime, let's get rid of our die and dump, and we'll add a comment to say attempt to log the user in. So we will use the auth attempt, and we need to pass in the email, which we get from our request variable. So we'll say request input email, and then the only other option we need here is the password, and this is a plain text password. And again, this comes from a request input password. Now if we pass in a valid email and password, let's redirect the user. So let's have a comment, and we'll just say if everything is correct, let's return a redirect, and let's go to a route. And this route that we're going to use is a dashboard. And we haven't made this route yet, so let's switch over to administration, and we'll just have a comment for dashboard. And for now, let's just make a basic route. So we'll say get dashboard, and we'll have a function, and in here let's just do a die and dump, and we'll say I am on the dashboard. And let's also not forget to give this route a name of administration.dashboard. So now we can take this route name and we can pass it into our redirect route. So administration.dashboard. Let's switch over to Chrome. Let's give this a refresh. And we have an error, and looks like I just have not imported the auth class. So let's go to the top of our file, and we'll just say use auth. And we'll clean this up a little bit. There we go. Let's give this a save and a refresh again. You can see that we are currently on the dashboard. So right now we're logged in, but we don't have a way to log out. So let's switch over to the administration routes. Let's clone one of these routes, and let's say logout, and make sure we're using the function logout, and we'll give it the name of administration authentication logout. And this function is very simple. In our auth controller, we'll just say logout, and let's use auth logout. And now let's return a redirect back to the user, and in this case let's use administration authentication. So that will switch us back to the login. So at the top, if we just replace dashboard with authentication, you can see our navigation bar is working. Because we're logged in, we have that welcome back support@lairacademy.co. So while we're here, let's change this drop down to include a logout link. So in navigation.blade.php, let's go ahead and let's change the drop down to my account, and we'll clean up these links here. So we'll say change password. We'll keep the separator, and the final thing that we're going to have is a logout. And let's make sure that we're passing in the route. Sorry, it's not that. It's route administration.authentication.logout. Save this file, and let's switch back into Chrome. Give it a refresh. If we click on my account and we click logout, you can see the right hand navigation is now gone. So we're successfully logged out. Now we got a little sidetracked there, but what if we enter a email and a password that doesn't exist or doesn't validate? Well, currently we don't get anything back. So if we go to our auth controller, after our attempt, let's return a redirect, and let's go back to the current page that we were on with the input and then with errors. And this will fill up the errors or the message bag, and let's say invalid email and or password combination. Let's save this, give it a refresh, and you can see at the top we have our error now. And now we're almost done. Switch back to Sublime, and in the auth controller, in the constructor, let's add the middleware of guest and allow them only to access the index function as well as the login function. Let's add another middleware, but this time let's add it for auth. And we want to make sure that they can only access the logout function. To test this, let's log into our application. So we'll pass in an email and a password. And then we'll change our URL to our login. You can see that we will get a not found exception. And this is our middleware doing its job. Now the final thing we're going to have to do is change one of the middleware classes. Inside middleware, load up Authenticate, and when we redirect the guest, instead of saying login, just redirect them back to the regular page. So in the end, we will forward them on to a default URL that we will specify. Now let's clean up our dashboard by making a new folder, Administration Dashboard, and within that folder, let's create a new file, and let's just call it index.blade.php. Let's make sure that we extend our master layout here. And then we will start our section for our content. And for now, let's just add in some basic text. Just say I'm the dashboard. Give this a save. And instead of dying and dumping in our route, let's return the view of administration dashboard.index. Make sure we save everything, and let's log in. And once we log in, we're put right to the dashboard. This brings us to the end of the video, and now we have authentication implemented. Let's move on to the next step. Thanks.